Hello, everybody. My name is Matthias Caldwell. I'm a career development specialist within the Career Center here at Sacramento State University, and I'm going to be talking to you today about resume and cover letter writing. So, without any further ado, let's dive right in. So, just before we get started, some learning objectives. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to be able to differentiate between different types of resumes, namely chronological and functional resumes. You're going to be able to name and identify some best practices for resume and cover letter development. And then we're going to do a critique of a resume kind of sections at the end of this presentation, which would admittedly be a little bit easier in person, but even with the recorded feature, we're going to try to do that together as well at the very end. So just some things to consider as you're kind of listening to me talk about resumes and cover letters today. So one thing is just, are you confident with the resume that you have? Just kind of be thinking about that as we go through these different topics and slides today. Did you know that while attending college, you're actually acquiring the skills you need to be able to list on your resume? So the things you're doing in classes, in projects and assignments, the things that you participate with, clubs and activities on campus, the jobs, of course, that you're holding down, whether they're on campus or off campus. These are all things that can be going onto your resume right now. So definitely, your time in college is well spent in terms of, building experiences that you can talk about. And then lastly, but definitely not least, is the idea that, the first human eyes that see your resume may only look at it for a brief period of time. In this case, 5 to 7 seconds is what some statistics say. Some say 5 to 10 seconds. However you slice it, it means that you need to get their attention quickly. And so it's important to make your document easy to read, easy on the eyes, and it's also really important to tailor that information to specific postings or applications, right? So you may not have an identical resume for every single job you apply for, because you want to make sure that if they're only looking at it for a brief period of time, it has to really resonate with them. So let's dive right into resume writing. So there's some things to consider in terms of kind of like quick tips before we get through the resume section. And we're going to talk about some more of these in a bit more depth as we go, but you just want to kind of front load some of this information. Keep it brief, right? So we talked about how quickly someone has to maybe look at your resume for the first time. And so that means that you want to make sure that it's easy to read, it's quick to read, that they're not slogging through long sections, that it's something that is easily consumable for, a recruiter or a hiring manager. You want to avoid writing in the first person. I know it sounds kind of funny, but we actually want to write, third person. So, you don't want any I, me, we language on your resume. Anything you list, whether it's, career or work history or educational history, you want to make sure it's listed in reverse chronological order. So whatever you're doing most recently, working backwards, in time to whatever was further in the past. You want to showcase your experience and accomplishments using bullet point format and action verbs, so strong language. And those bullet points are key, right? So like I mentioned, if you're only having 10 seconds to look at a resume, if you're a recruiter, you want to make sure that you can find the information quickly. And so we want to avoid those big paragraph chunks that some people put on resumes and break those down into more bite-sized, consumable pieces of information that a recruiter or a hiring manager, an employer can really assimilate quickly. Obviously, you want to be talking about relevant skill sets and experiences. You don't need to put references on your resume. So at the most, if you really have space in the bottom, you could have one line that maybe says, references available upon request. But even that's probably unnecessary these days, just because, almost every job is going to require references, so they're going to be expecting it. They'll probably ask for that later in the job application and interview phase if you become a finalist, or it might be built into the body of an application online where you input that information. So it's just not necessary to put it on a resume where, that space is valuable space that could be used talking about some of your skills and experiences. And then last but certainly not least, you definitely want to check for typos. And just overall, you want your document to be super uniform and clean and tidy. It's your first impression for most job applications. And so, that making sure that your document looks the way you want it to look, and that you put your strong foot forward. Everything's formatted the same, the font is all the same all the way through, things like that can go a long ways toward making your resume something that you're going to be confident with. Okay, let's dive into the actual sections here. And so I'm going to work from, just kind of top down through a resume. And I think it's maybe a good point to talk about the fact that, within our Career Center, we our best practices really entail the idea of a simple, kind of straightforward, top to bottom resume format. So we're not really in favor of those side-to-side fillable templates that you can find online. I know those are tempting. They're easy to input information into, but the reality is there is something called applicant tracking systems out there, and that's ATS. You may have heard of them. They're automated reviews of resumes that many companies will use. And they often have a difficulty with those side-to-side fillable templates. And so we really recommend just building your document freestyle in Word or Google Docs and from top to bottom, if that makes sense. And so I'm going to start at the top of what a resume, should have, and then we'll kind of work our way through. So contact information goes right at the top. Obviously, there's no one way to do it. You can center it. I think that looks nice. You can stack it like the top example. You could put it kind of all on one line, separated by maybe some bullet points, the way the second one does. It kind of depends on how much space you need on the page. If you're really looking to conserve space, you're running out of space, you want to keep it to one page, you might go with the second option here. If you have a little more flexibility with space on your page, the top version can look really nice. I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that what you can see is there's not an actual address on the resume, at least not required any longer. And that's just for your privacy, right? If you want to include your address, you can, but very few people are going to be reaching out to you with snail mail these days. It's almost all email, phone. And so just making sure that they know that you're local, maybe in Sacramento, or if you're going back home for the summer or after you graduate, whatever location that you're planning to apply to jobs from, you can just put that city, that area code, etc. Or zip code, excuse me, and state, and that's usually sufficient to let them know your regional location. Phone number and email, just make sure that it is something you're comfortable with, that it's semi-professional, right? So student email is great. Keep in mind though that after you graduate, within I think it's about 2 years or so, you will time out and you'll have to transition into an alumni email. And so if you're applying to jobs around that time, still using a student email, that might not be the best idea. You might want to have a personal email that is, something that you feel confident with. No legacy emails. We don't want that middle school email with a pop culture reference that you're still using as your personal email. Something that is just a little more straightforward is probably better to be using in the job search process. Phone number, and this might sound silly, but you'd be surprised how often people have old voicemail, greetings on their phone. So make sure that it's up to date and relevant. You want to make sure that when they call and if they leave you a message that, that voicemail greeting sounds like you. It's not from 4 or 5 years ago when you had a different voice, and we want to make sure that it sounds like who you are and that you're saying what you want it to say, right? So, sometimes our greetings from when we were a little bit younger are a little more informal. Just make sure that it's something you feel comfortable and confident with. Okay, moving on. So the next section right below your contact information, and usually I would put just kind of like a dividing borderline between contact and the rest of the content information. But what comes next would be maybe something called like a summary, right? I think a summary is a really great way to speak directly to a hiring manager. There are different ways of approaching it. Some people might want to do maybe an objective if they're doing some sort of in-person networking event where they're not actually applying to a job. They're just wanting to kind of hand out resumes and make contacts. Maybe if you're going to a career fair, for example, you might have an objective, which is a kind of like a summary, but with the addition of maybe some goals or some aims that you have. But for most people who are using a resume to apply for a job, the summary is probably a better bet. And just that the reason for that is because the objective is usually inherent in the application when you are submitting a job application online. They know why you're applying for that job. And so a summary is usually a better way of approaching it. It's a kind of a high level executive overview of who you are, what you're doing, some, experience or strengths you have, some value that you can bring to the table. And so we have a couple examples here. The first one you can see, experienced Sacramento State University design student with strong skills in project management, renovation, and AutoCAD. So we're seeing who the person is, what they're studying, that they are a student, the skill sets that they have that relate to the position in question. And this is really important. I talked about tailoring the resume at the beginning. So this really, everything you put on a resume should be relevant to the position you're applying for. And so those skills that we're picking out are things that, in theory, this person has seen on a job posting or an internship posting, and so they're addressing that directly, right? They're not just randomly picking skill sets out of thin air that they think apply to themselves. They are targeting the summary to in the job posting in many ways. And the summary is actually one of the most malleable, changeable, flexible aspects of your document. So this might be one of the places that you'll see the most tailoring compared to some other sections. Another example below, business student concentrating in accounting, experience with formulas, VLOOKUPs, and pivot tables in Excel, strong background in processing and auditing payroll information, knowledgeable in California federal tax procedures and laws. So again, very targeted language, very targeted skill sets. This is a resume summary that someone is using to apply to a job that specifically applies to those skill sets that you might need moving into the accounting world, right? You wouldn't necessarily use that summary for, applying to a summer camp counselor job, in between, your junior and senior year of college, right? You see what I'm saying? So there is that element of tailoring the summary really to fit the posting that you're interested in and the opportunity that you're applying to. And then we would move down the document to education. Now, you don't have to put education next, but for, I think, many students and recent graduates, leading with education can be a great way to kind of, communicate who you are and what you've been doing recently to a potential employer. That way they're not, trying to figure out why you don't have 10 years of experience until they get to the very bottom and they realize, oh, they're a student. Lead with that. We want them to read your document through the lens of understanding that, you are a current student, that you, have been focusing on school, whether that's full-time, part-time. That's been a big focus of yours over, X amount of years. And so we want them to read that way. I think you can see right here, this is a great example. We're getting into the sections where formatting is really important, right? Education section, experience sections that will come next. This is that cleanliness, the tidiness of the document that I mentioned at the very beginning. You can see this is very easy to read, very easy to consume. All the font is the same, type of font. There's some bolding, some all caps to differentiate, headers and titles. But for the most part, very easy to for a recruiter to skim through this and find, your information quickly. I think important, you can see everything's spelled out. So, Bachelor of Arts, in psychology, not BA, California State University, Sacramento, not Sac State. You want to be able to spell everything out, make it look professional. And then if you haven't graduated yet, you can simply put expected and then the month and the year that you are intending to graduate. If you have graduated, you can just drop that expected right off your document. Now, a lot of people might put subcategories within education sections, honors, technical skills, languages are what we see on this example. Ideally, you're picking things that are related to, the position, the opportunity that you're interested in. This is a great place to put some of those technology skills. I think most jobs nowadays have some sort of, digital fluency requirement. And so this can be a great place to kind of include some of that, the basics, right? You can see some of the Microsoft Office, Zoom stuff that is a little more fundamental to tech skills, whereas, SPSS statistics, that might be a little more higher level and specific to, data collection and analysis. Gen AI, this is something you could talk about on your resume if you're confident in prompt creation or what that, whatever that might look like. Languages, if you have a job that's, involving, other languages that you're applying to, this could be a good place to put that. I think it's important to know that, really your college, especially the four-year college information, is what you're going to be highlighting here. You can probably leave high school information off. Even community college information off, you can probably, leave that off your document unless maybe you earned specifically an AA degree that is relevant to the job you're applying to. But if you just earned like maybe an AA to transfer, an AS to transfer, you can probably save space. I would put some of these subcategories and the Sac State information instead of maybe some of that transfer information. It's flexible though. It's something that you come into the Career Center and talk with us about if you have any questions. But a lot of times you're going to want to really focus on what you're doing now as part of your university career and some of the skills and experiences that you've gained through your education that might be related to an internship or a job you're applying to. And then these are some additional subcategories that you might consider, putting into that area of your document. Some people, might put achievements or credentials that they've earned. We've already talked about language skills, those honors and awards. Related coursework, that's a really great one for, a lot of internship applications that might have some sort of knowledge requirement in a subject field that, maybe you've learned about in a class or a set of classes, but you maybe don't have the job experience in that field yet. So some people might list some of the coursework in this as a subcategory that's related to, a position they're interested in. Projects and class projects you've worked on. We've already talked about those computer skills. There's a lot of different things that you could put as subcategories within education. And I think this is one of those areas that's going to change very, significantly from one person to the next. What I would put in this area might be different than you or the person sitting next to you in a class, right? And so these are all things that you can kind of evaluate on an individual basis. Moving down the document again into the experience section, this is really the heart of your document. And this is where we have different types, different formats of resume that I mentioned in the very, very beginning of this presentation. We're going to be differentiating here. So there are chronological resumes and there are functional resumes. We're going to be talking about chronological resume, formats first right here on this slide. Chronological resume is really, I would say, more the traditional resume. It is listing your work experience in reverse chronological order. And it's the resume format that really the majority of employers and hiring managers are familiar with and expecting. So there is a strength to that, the ability to, kind of speak to the norm there. And when you're building a resume this way, you can have, again, very clean sections. You can see that this is an experience section that's easy to read, easy to find information. Very simple, listing of the job title. In this case, the first example, it's a funding intern, and then the organization title, location, and then the date range. You could put to present, right? If you are, knowing that a human is going to be looking at your resume first, you might put to the date of application if you're trying to, work the ATS system that we've talked about, and we'll talk about this more later. But you can see it's nice and clean, right? All that on kind of one line. Sometimes if the organization and the job title are too long to fit on one line with the date range, you might, put that into 2 lines. But you can see that you want it to be nice and tidy. Then this is really important. This is when we're talking about breaking down those paragraphs that some people want to include on a resume into more bite-sized consumable pieces of information. So we're going to do bullet points in your experience section. Bullet points are going to be easy for a recruiter to read, easy for them to, understand, and then move on to the next bullet point. It allows them to sort of skim if necessary, which we know that they do from the amount of time that they're spending on a resume. We're trying to hook their information with each bullet point and get them to read the next one, right? So a lot of what your document is doing is trying to get their attention. That summary that we talked about at the very beginning, that's to hook them, right? That's to make them say, maybe I'll spend 2 minutes on this resume instead of 10 seconds. And each bullet point is hopefully going to pull their attention in with strong language and strong accomplishment, action language that's going to be telling not just what you did, but what you accomplished and why you accomplished it as part of that role. And so I think what we can see here is, our bullet points are not, 1 or 2 lines. That first bullet point here, this person could have just said wrote business letters and been done. And I'll put my hand up. I've done that in the past on resumes. I've had very brief, overly brief bullet points. But really, they've expanded. They've provided context. We want to walk that balance between providing enough context and specificity, but also keeping it concise and easy to read. And so what you can see, I think this first bullet point on the page is a really good example of that balance. So they wrote not just wrote business letters, they've wrote over 24 business letters. So what they did, how much they've quantified, to local companies, that's the who that they're doing it for or to request sponsorship for the agency. So that's the why, the purpose, and almost every bullet point you create can usually get to a why. And then it increased agency funding by 15% over the year. That's great, right? It's a very strong statement ending in an outcome, a quantifiable result. Now, of course, not every bullet point that you create is going to have, a quantifiable outcome. But when it makes sense, you're going to want to try to include that kind of specificity. We can see on the second entry, the office assistant one at the bottom, there's a bullet point, corresponded with over 25 clients and vendors on a daily basis. So they're saying what they did, how much, the frequency, to answer questions regarding product, sales, inventory, and shipping procedures. So it's a very full statement. And I think what you're going to see is that you want your bullet points to be really between 1 to 2 lines on a full-size piece of paper. I know the bullet point that I read first is technically onto the 3rd line, but that's really just because it's a PowerPoint and it's a little more squished. On a piece of paper or a Word document, that's going to be within that 1 to 2 line length. What I always say is if it's just like half of a line, it's not long enough, right? So it's either not long enough to include, or it's not long enough, but it's important enough that we need to expand it to that 1.5 lines kind of thing. If it goes on to the 3rd line of a resume, it might be starting to look a little bit too long, a little bit like a paragraph that we want to avoid as well. So that balance is really important to strike. So you really want to provide, the who, what, where, when, why kind of context as much as possible, while at the same time, keeping it brief and concise. And you can also see, strong language in here, right? Researched policies and procedures, corresponded with over 25 clients and vendors, right? We're not, using passive language. We're using active language that, puts you front and center in the activity that was taking place. And that's really, a chronological resume format is you're listing those work experiences and you're talking about, the bullet points that, reflect some of the things that you did in that job that connect to the position you're applying to. And that's the important thing right here, right? We're not just listing things we did. We're really talking about the things that we can find that have translatable, experiences, skills, etc., right? So if you worked at a restaurant, which that's what I did in college, you're not, saying I wiped tables, I served food. Yeah, we know that you did that, but you're talking about, providing high level, customer service. You're talking about, ability to effectively communicate with, X number of people during a busy shift. You're talking about the ability to, maintain composure in a high stress, fast paced environment, problem solving and critical thinking that you need to be able to do on the floor to solve issues as they arise, right? Those are the kind of translatable skill sets that you might be talking about for a restaurant job, for example, that might connect to many different jobs out there. And so it's all about kind of framing the things that you did and how you did them. So, that's, really a brief way of talking about this, but this is something you could come into the Career Center and we could have, an entire appointment talking about how to kind of make over your bullet points. Well, let's move on. So functional resume approach is, the other kind of main resume format that we talk about with students. Functional approach is listing your skills and relevant experiences as opposed to jobs. And so, whereas the chronological, you're just listing that job in reverse chronological order, date range, etc. The functional approach, you're saying, well, maybe I don't have that exact work experience that I need to be able to communicate that I can do this job, but I know that I have the skills and experience from other things to be able to, perform the job functions for which I'm applying. And you want to be able to communicate that. So a lot of students might rely on a functional approach while they're in school still and they haven't had jobs right before, right after they graduate. That might be a functional approach that you would adopt. So really what you're doing is you're organizing your categories instead of by job, by skill that you are seeing listed in the job description. So these are not random skill sets and knowledge that you're kind of just pulling out of thin air. These are things that the job or the internship posting is asking for. It's saying, we want you to be able to do this, this, and this. And you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to create a skill section or a knowledge section where I'm going to have bullet points talking about my ability to do those things. So for example, we can see this example has program development as a skill set, management and supervision, project management. That might be a little bit more advanced than what you would see in, a student resume. This might be someone who's trying to do a career change, but you can still see how they've seen skill sets that were listed in the job posting that were highlighted. Someone who's worked on in a programmatic capacity, someone who's had responsibility in management, someone who's been able to manage a project or work on a project, and they've broken that out into their categories. The bullet points themselves are very similar. You're going to create them the same way as a chronological resume. The difference being you can talk about more experiences. It's not confined to talking in your bullet points about a job, right? You can absolutely talk about jobs that you've had, but you might talk about, class, experiences, right? Projects you've worked on. You might talk about volunteer work or sports or clubs or really anything that you've done that is related to that, position you're applying to in these skill and knowledge categories. You can talk about. So there's a little more flexibility in the functional approach. And because some students graduate from college without really having had many jobs, sometimes they'll look at a functional, option. You might also see someone who's had a gap in their work history do this, or someone who's trying to do maybe a big career change might go with a functional approach because maybe the jobs that they've had don't align necessarily with the job they're trying to get, but they know they can do it and they're trying to communicate that through the skill experiences that they've had. You can still list your work experience below a functional section, but you aren't highlighting the jobs themselves. You're highlighting the skills and knowledge that you have that relates to the job or the internship in question. So, you might be reading an internship posting and saying, I want to apply to this internship, and they're asking for someone who's, really able to work as, part of a team in a collaborative environment. You want someone who's really attention to detail and has some organization skills. They might want someone who's, really good at communicating, both written and orally. And so you might create a functional section that has a communication skills category, maybe an organization or time management skills category, and then maybe like a teamwork or a collaboration category, right? You can see how that would relate to, a posting that that you might see on like an internship, for example. And that's kind of the difference between functional and chronological resume approaches. Now, we're getting toward the end of what you would say in a resume document. So, some people don't have much space at the bottom of their page if they're trying to keep it to one page, which, it can be a good idea for a current student or a recent graduate to keep it to one page. I think by the time you graduate, you get a few years of, professional experience. There's a little more flexibility to maybe get to, a page and a half, 2 pages, but always 2 pages max for a professional resume. But if you're trying to keep it to one, you don't have a lot of space, you might not include much beyond the experience section of it, however you format that. But for some people, they do have, experience beyond, the basic things that they want to talk about, or maybe they just have space on the page they need to fill. So there are a lot of random things you can include on the bottom of your resume, but you always want them to be connected in some way to the position you're applying for. It could be activities, could be workshops you've presented, professional development, maybe a conference that you went to as part of a class or a program. It's very different for different, kind of like the subcategories in education. These additional categories, these other experience categories at the bottom of your resume can look very different for different people. Here are just some examples of things you might include. Some people would put, the publications or interests, workshops, related experience, activities, maybe an international experience if you studied abroad or we're overseas for some period of time for whatever purpose. If it connects to the job, you might include it. Research or projects you've worked on. All of these things are things you could talk about at the end of a resume. You would just need to make sure that there is a connection point to the job you're applying to, right? So an example I always use is like, if you want to include interests, and you're applying to I don't know, a job with the state, right? You might not say, well, my interests are, eating ice cream and playing video games, right? That tells us a little bit about your personality, but it doesn't necessarily connect to the job in question. But let's say you're looking to, apply to I don't know, be a camp counselor after you graduate in a wilderness survival camp in the outdoors. And you say interest, well, I've been mountaineering for, 5 years. Now that's connected, even though it's personal and it's an interest, it has a connection point to the position you're applying to. So that's that kind of analysis, that critical thinking you need to employ when you're creating your resume. All right, we're going to change gears here a little bit and talk about technology. So I've been talking about technology a little bit throughout this presentation, mostly with the idea of applicant tracking systems and ATS. But we know that Gen AI is a big part of the world right now in academia and the job search, and so it's important to address it. Now, this could be an entire presentation all on its own. And I have one slide, so I'm going to do my best to get through some of the main points. But keep in mind, we're always available as a resource in the Career Center to talk about some of these things in more depth. I think the first thing to be aware of is that having skills and competencies in generative AI and pairing that with critical thinking, these are in-demand skills that there are companies out there, organizations that will want people that have those skills. So it is actually something you could put on a resume in a technical skills section or a technology section. That being said, when you're using Gen AI to work on your documents, if you're using it, you want to be careful about how you're using it. You want to use it ethically. You may want to use Gen AI to draft or brainstorm for materials, help you outline things. You may not want to use it to actually write the document for you. As tempting as that can be, Gen AI can sound similar, right? When you have recruiters who are out there receiving hundreds of applications and they look at resumes that all sound very, very similar, it's often because people are having Gen AI write the documents for them. There isn't that personal tone or language coming through. And it is your responsibility to check for accuracy and use it ethically. I mean, generative AI pulls from the internet to help source for its information. And we know that not everything on the internet is accurate and correct. And so, you do need to make sure that whatever you're using it for, that you're double checking to make sure that it is, accurate information, especially as it pertains to you, right? Because this is, a resume reflects who you are in many ways. And then, of course, just another word of warning is that some employers and those applicant tracking systems we've been talking about, they can recognize use of AI, especially they can recognize when there's an overuse of it, right? So if you're using it to brainstorm and outline, that's probably fine. If you're using it to write entire sections of the document for you, employers are probably going to be able to figure that out, and some employers may look unfavorably upon that. So that's just information to kind of be aware of. Applicant tracking systems. I've been mentioning this all throughout the presentation. It's a really important topic. Again, this could be an entire presentation itself, but we're going to talk about some of the most important things to be aware of when it comes to ATS and resumes. I think the first thing to be aware of is applicant tracking systems. These automated first reviews of resumes are used by many Fortune 500 companies. So a lot of the really big companies are using them. The Googles, the Amazons that get 50, 70,000 applications and resumes per week. They necessarily have to sift through some of those somehow. And so they're using these automated first review systems. That being said, there's growth into mid-level companies, smaller companies. So there's a lot of companies out there using ATS. It's not only the big boys, right? And so you do need to make sure that you're incorporating, elements of your resume that are going to be, applicable to ATS and be able to kind of navigate that. So things to be aware of, things to avoid is you want to avoid those resume templates that I was talking about at the beginning, those side-to-side fillable templates that are so tempting. They're out there online. ATS often can't read them. And so you may not even get a look on your application because the ATS can't read your resume and it filters you right to the bottom of the pile. You want to avoid graphic resumes, anything with icons, imagery, different fonts and colors. The ATS may not always be able to to read those properly. And again, you could get sifted to the bottom of an application funnel. Tables, columns, these are things that can also be difficult for ATS to read, and hence that's why we're talking about the simple top to bottom format, right? Not a lot of those side to side formats, even if you're freestyle building. And then headers, right? This is something that we haven't mentioned yet, but any kind of formatted header cannot be read by ATS often. And so you can put your contact information at the top of the page. Just make sure to freestyle build that into the body of the document. Don't create a header that's going to continue on to the next page, because your resume might be great, but ATS might not be able to read your contact information, and so you might get shifted to the bottom of the pile again because they don't have a contact for you, because that automated system can't read your document. So I did mention this one briefly, this third bullet point. You may consider adding the current date or the date of application as the end date for a present job on a resume. When you're applying, you have to kind of balance, creating a document for human eyes, but also balance creating a document that can get through ATS. For human eyes, it is nice to see to current when you have a current job in that date range. But ATS doesn't always read to present or to current. Some of them can, and if they do, they're just going to convert it to the date of application anyways. But some of them won't. So if you've been at a current job for 5 years and you say, I've been working here from January 2020 to present, and the ATS can't read to present, you may lose X amount of years of credit for that experience. Whereas if you put the date of application, at least you'll know you'll get that credit within ATS if they're using it. You want to make sure you're saving your tailored resume as a new file each time. We recommend PDF is probably the most compatible format for most ATS out there. Even PDFs are going to corrupt over time. So about 40, 50 uses, you can find a corruptible PDF that can't be read by ATS. But this is why tailoring is important, right? You're going to be changing it for different job applications. So it shouldn't be a problem as long as you're tailoring your document and then resaving it as a new file. And then lastly, something to be aware of is that chronological resumes may be preferred. It doesn't mean you need to use a chronological resume, but it is a little easier for ATS to assign credit for a work experience when they have a date range available, whereas the functional approach sometimes doesn't include the same type of date range in those skill and experience sections. Doesn't mean you can't use a functional approach. You still can. It'll get through ATS. It's just a little bit different kind of format than it's used to. But if you want to go a little bit deeper with some of these questions, feel free to come into the Career Center. All right, let's talk briefly about cover letter writing, because I know I'm going on and on. Cover letters are involved in many application processes. Anything in public kind of service will often require a cover letter of some kind. You want to make sure you're showing your interest in the role, marketing yourself as a candidate. You want to expand on specific achievements, and you want to try to focus on some of those qualifications that you possess. So really, cover letters have kind of like 4 main sections that we would recommend. The first section would be that kind of introduction. It's who you are. You might talk about, who you are, what you've been doing, maybe the specific job title that you're applying for, how you heard about it. Did you hear about it at a career fair? Did you meet, a recruiter at a tabling event on campus? Did you find it online? Were you referred by a faculty member? And then you might have a summary sentence that kind of highlights why you're a good candidate. So that who you are kind of introduction paragraph. The next section might be your, qualifications. What is it that qualifies you for the position? And this is not, you're not rewriting your entire resume in paragraph form. You're picking, 2, 3, 4 items that have the most connection points to the job in question, and you're expanding on those few items in this qualifications section. So again, you're not rewriting everything on your resume. In fact, you cannot do that in a cover letter. It's just not possible, right? You're going to be kind of expanding, giving examples of some of those critical experiences that you want to highlight. Third section might be the why are you interested in the position. This is sort of the passion piece. Is there an anecdotal story about you, why you're interested in the job or the industry or the company? This is where you can talk about why you might go above and beyond, why you'd be the perfect fit beyond your qualifications, etc. And then lastly is the kind of exit salutation, the goodbye, right? Thank you for taking the time to read my document. I look forward to hearing from you, et cetera, et cetera. So really it's who are you? What are your qualifications? Why are you interested? And then goodbye. So who, what, why, goodbye. And that's a great way to kind of, create a solid cover letter. Biggest challenges I see or frequently see with people bringing cover letters in is they might just forget that a cover letter needs to be written well, in the sense that you need to write it kind of like you'd write an essay. You need to have, introduction, topic sentences. You need to have supporting thoughts built into your paragraphs. You need to have transition sentences that connect different thoughts. You can't just jump from one idea to the next. You need to connect those thoughts. You might need a summary sentence at the end of the paragraph, just the way you would when you're writing an essay for a class. The other big kind of challenge I see is people that are maybe getting that order out of place. They might be leading with that section 3, right? So that the paragraph about the passion, they might start with that, which is not, it's okay to be really passionate about the job you want, but usually you want to introduce yourself first. You want to, talk about what, how you can meet those qualifications, and then get into the why am I passionate. That would be my recommendation. All right, so we're going to try to do a brief little resume critique here. I know it's going to be different on a recording than it would be in person, but we'll kind of go through some sections together. So this is, these are going to be individual sections we're looking at. So it's not one entire, document. But let's look at an education section here. Just take a moment to look at it. Is it a good section, a bad section, somewhere in between? What are you seeing that could be improved upon? And just take a moment. Okay, so I would say it's not great, right? There's some things about it that are okay. Some of the headings look pretty clean. But other than that, it's really not a great section. You've got a lot of abbreviations, BA in psychology, Sac State, things like that. Graduated in, you could probably just leave that off and just put May 2023. You would want to say Bachelor of Arts in psychology or comma psychology. It looks like some of the font sizes might be a little bit different. You want to make sure that everything is uniform and looks good. The skills section, you can have a skills section, but I would say if you're going to include skill sections, it should be a little more specific. We have bilingual, but what languages? Computer skills, which skills? Things like that. And then I would say this is more preferential, but I would say, a skill section, at least for ATS, it's better if it's more hard skills, technical skills. Whereas the soft skills, those team player, communicator, multitasker, things like that, those can be built into the body of your document in the bullet points. So if you are, feeling like your collaboration, your teamwork is a critical component to your getting a job, and it's a soft skill, that's something you could talk about in a bullet point. If it's important, it should be in a bullet point. Same with your communication skills or your ability to multitask. So what I would avoid is the joint soft and hard skill sections. I would pick a hard skill section if you're going to have a skill section. All right, let's look at these. These are obviously two different section samples of work experience, and take a look at these real quick. And are they good, bad, somewhere in between? So looking at the top one, we can see that formatting, the basic formatting is actually pretty clean, but there are some typos. So if they didn't have the typos, it might be a little bit better. Server spelled wrong. The bullet points are a little basic. Guided arriving guests to tables, took drink orders and relayed information to bartenders. That's kind of what we were talking about when I was, in the chronological section. There are some higher level things you could talk about in a restaurant or a bar, whatever you've been working in, that might be a little bit more translatable in terms of skill sets. Forested, enjoyable event atmosphere through guest interaction. That feels like a spelling error. So while the formatting, the basic look of it isn't terrible, it could be a lot better, right? Second section here, I would say, is kind of the opposite. The bullet point content is pretty good, but the formatting's all over the place. We've got, like kind of cursive writing. We've got some different color fonts. I wouldn't recommend doing either of those things. So if you could kind of get the initial formatting of the top one, but with the content and information of the bottom one, might be, a good happy medium. And this is kind of, you can see there's only 2 bullet points for each of these. And a lot of the samples I showed you in the chronological and functional resumes only had 2 bullet points. But you actually, in a real resume, you probably have, 3 to 5 bullet points per job section or skill section. We just didn't have the space on a PowerPoint to do that. All right, let's move into just some recap here of some tools that you can use. We have the job and internship handbook on our website that has some great resume samples and cover letter, basics that you can look at for reference points. How to connect with us. This is really important. Coming into the Career Center is a great way to get your questions answered. I know a recording like this, you probably have a million questions that I wasn't able to answer because I don't know what they are. But feel free to come in and book an appointment. We're in Lassen Hall 1013. That's the first floor, right? We share space with academic advising. So we're right to the left of that main kind of mural on the wall in Lassen Hall. Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, we're open for business, and you can call or email if you need some help booking an appointment. We have full 45-minute sessions that are both virtual and in person, so we're pretty flexible there. And we also have 15-minute drop-in sessions for quick questions. This is not a full appointment. This is something you would do if you just, have something come up on the day that you really want to, get some quick answers to. We have, drop-in hours Monday to Friday, both in person and virtual, and you can see what those are on the website as well. If you want to connect with us, you can scan this QR code really quick and follow us online and get information about different events that we have throughout the year. And this would be kind of where we would wrap things up. So thank you so much. Lastly, I hope you got some good information out of this presentation today, and I hope you will stop by the Career Center and make an appointment or come to drop-ins and connect with us in some way, because we are, an available resource to you both now and after you graduate. Thank you.